Until the late 20th century, Tudor Place was a private residence protected from prying eyes by a dense landscape. When completed in the second decade of the 19th century, passers-by could easily admire the mansion and grounds from nearby streets and walks. But as the landscape matured, the house grew isolated. This beautiful house became hidden behind ancient bushes, trees, and fences, eventually fading from view. Likewise, the Peter family guarded its privacy and did not regularly open their home to the public. The situation changed significantly when the last owner deeded the property to a private foundation in 1984, and 4 years later, it opened as a historic house museum. Now a professional staff was available to give tours and devise educational programs to raise public awareness of Tudor Place's architecture, collection, archive, landscape, and family associations. With its new status came documentary investigations, archaeology, and restoration projects that contribute knowledge and insight into its history and development. Through these programs, myths and conjecture are being replaced by historical certainty, which helps shape new interpretations and promote a clearer understanding of the property's intriguing past. Designing Tudor Place. Planning, building, and endowing Tudor Place with the architectural interest it has today were the collaborative work of several people, including an amateur architect, an unknown builder, and the clients. The project began in 1805 when Thomas and Martha Peter paid Francis Lowndes $8,000 for the site of their future estate. The property was located on the heights above Georgetown with views of the Potomac River. At 8.5 acres, it was far bigger than the lots being sold in Georgetown, which were narrow and deep, intended for urban townhouses. The Peters house would be different, a freestanding, 5-part mansion, the type long favored by wealthy planters of Tidewater, Maryland, and Virginia. Martha had been born at Mount Vernon, where she often returned to visit her grandmother, Martha Washington, the woman for whom she was named. Mount Vernon was a prime example of a 5-part house, and it most likely helped form Martha Peters' ideas regarding the general outlines of a fine residence. Already standing on the lot were a pair of 2-story wings and 1-story hyphens, 4 pieces of a 5-part house. Lowndes, a Bladensburg merchant who had settled in Georgetown, had bought the property in 1794 and soon began a substantial Georgian house, the popular 18th century architectural style known for its symmetry and center hall plan. In the middle of Lowndes' structures was a 53-foot wide gap intended for the main dwelling that had not yet been built. Large structures were often built in stages, beginning with the outer wings and moving inward toward the more expensive center. This is how Thomas Jefferson undertook Monticello, and it was the way the U.S. Capitol would be built. Under new ownership, the house was completed by Thomas and Martha Peter. The design of what Lowndes intended for the central block is not known, but the entire house would have had an impressive 150-foot brick facade. Dendrochronology and other physical evidence indicate that the Lowndes wings and hyphens were constructed with lumber cut in the winters of 1793-94 and 1794-95. The 2-story wings measured approximately 38 by 20 feet and were built of brick laid in Flemish bond, expensive brickwork that was meant to be seen, but is now hidden under stucco. Additional refinements included molded water tables and rubbed string courses, costly details that by 1805 were slipping out of fashion. The 1-story hyphens had slightly smaller footprints. The west wing served as the family residence, while the east wing contained the stables and coach house with rooms above likely used as slave quarters or storerooms. A brick kitchen, 34 by 16 feet, and 4 outbuildings stood nearby. Another 1-story building, perhaps slave quarters, was also located on the property. A wooden smokehouse constructed in the winter of 1793-94 is the only 18th century outbuilding that still stands. In addition to Thomas and Martha Peter, there were 5 children living in the unfinished residence, which Martha Peter's aunt, Rosalie Steer Calvert, described as being extremely small. It was about 1,800 square feet. More room would be added, but not for a while. The Peter family's architectural contribution to Tudor Place hinged on how they filled the 53-foot gap between the Lowndes wings. It is not known if they ever intended to carry on with the outmoded Georgian style or if they always intended to build something au courant. The 11 years that passed from the time of purchase, 1805, to the start of construction, 1816, allowed ample opportunity to consider the options, but ultimately they decided to forgo the past and build a thoroughly modern center section in the neoclassical style. Just as important, 11 years allowed time to secure the financial resources necessary for such an undertaking. Assisting in this venture was their family friend, Dr. William Thornton. Tudor Place is one of the most significant early 19th century homes in Washington, D.C., both for its architectural value and for the American history it holds within its walls. Its story begins in 1805, when Thomas Peter and his wife, Martha Custis Peter, purchased the property on the heights of Georgetown for $8,000. The land offered sweeping views of the Potomac River and was far larger than typical town lots in the area, about 8.5 acres in total. Martha Custis Peter was no ordinary Washingtonian. She was the granddaughter of Martha Washington and step-granddaughter of George Washington, having grown up visiting Mount Vernon. That home, with its iconic 5-part Palladian layout, heavily influenced Martha's vision for Tudor Place. She and her husband intended to create a grand estate that reflected their wealth, heritage, and social status. The property they purchased already had some significant structures built by the previous owner, Francis Lowndes, a merchant from Bladensburg. Around 1794, Lowndes had begun constructing a Georgian-style house on the land. He completed 2 two-story brick wings and 2 connecting 1-story hyphens, but left a large 53-foot wide gap where the central block of the house would eventually stand. This building method, starting with the wings and moving inward, was common at the time and was even used in building the U.S. Capitol and Monticello. When the Peters acquired the property, they inherited these incomplete buildings. The West Wing became the family's living quarters, while the East Wing held the stables and possibly slave quarters above. There were other outbuildings as well, a kitchen, a coach house, and a smokehouse, the last of which still survives today. Life at Tudor Place began modestly. By 1805, the Peters and their 5 children lived in what Martha's aunt Rosalie Steer Calvert described as extremely small, only about 1,800 square feet. But the grand vision was never forgotten. For 11 years, the Peters considered how best to complete the home. During that time, they also worked to gather the resources for the ambitious project. In 1816, they finally began construction on the central block, working with their family friend, Dr. William Thornton, who was the first architect of the U.S. Capitol. Together, they chose a refined, neoclassical style that was more modern than the Georgian wings already in place. The final result was a 5-part mansion, 2 wings, 2 hyphens, and a central section that blended old and new architectural styles. The 150-foot-long brick facade was grand and imposing, with symmetrical balance and elegant proportions. The house was not just a statement of wealth, it became a home full of stories. Over the generations, 6 members of the Peter family lived in Tudor Place, spanning over 180 years. The family's connection to George Washington and their position in the Washington social scene gave the house a unique role in American history. During the Civil War, the family's divided loyalties, some supporting the Union, others the Confederacy, mirrored the nation's turmoil. Still, the house stood strong through war, Reconstruction, and modern change. It wasn't until 1983, after nearly 2 centuries of private ownership, that the last living descendant of Thomas and Martha Peter deeded the house and grounds to a private foundation. In 1988, Tudor Place opened as a public museum. Since then, it has been preserved not just as a building, but as a repository of American history. The house holds over 18,000 artifacts, including many personal belongings of the Washington and Peter families. Today, Tudor Place is more than a beautifully preserved example of Federal-era architecture. It is a window into the past, a story of a family, a city, and a young nation growing together.